So, good afternoon, everybody. We thank you all. We just need to get started. I'm conscious we have people who are also joining us online, so we need to try and coordinate. You're very welcome to this afternoon's session on a very important topic, the reform of research assessment. And people, I suppose, who've been closely watching this agenda will be aware that it's a very live topic across Europe, and there's a lot of discussion ongoing. So I'm delighted that this afternoon we're joined by a number of speakers, and we'll have a panel session following two speakers. So delighted to introduce, first of all, we'll have Dr Teresa Maguire from the Health Research Board, and I'll do a little proper introduction to you in a moment, Teresa. And we're also then joined by Dr Flores Bueso, who will speak to us after Teresa, and then for our panel session we'll be joined then by just Ashling, I think, isn't it, from the library. So looking forward to discussing what I said already is a very important topic. From the University of Limerick's perspective, we have recently become a signatory to DORA. We are also a member, one of the early members of CoARA, and like the Health Research Board, one of the first signatories to it. We've had a lot of internal discussion about research assessment, and we have also a statement about the responsible use of metrics as an institution. So I say that to kind of set the scene for the conversation, and I think we've already made some key decisions around how we consider research assessment. We have colleagues in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Science who have developed a document that is explicating the disciplinary norms within arts, humanities and social sciences. So we're very much about kind of that parity of esteem of our disciplines and understanding what's recognised as research excellence within disciplines, but then also getting to grips with some of the larger related aspects of this wide topic: open science, data management, assessment of research CVs. Then there's the wider context from predatory journals. Unfortunately, we only have a little over an hour and a half here this afternoon. We could spend a lot longer on this topic, but I am confident you're going to have a very enriched experience from listening to our two speakers and also being joined by Ashling later. So I will introduce then Dr Teresa Maguire, who is the Director of Strategy and Funding at the Health Research Board. And as I mentioned, the Health Research Board were, I think, the first funding agency, Teresa, in Ireland to sign CoARA and that reform of research assessment, and are also a signatory of DORA. So just to talk a little bit about Teresa and her background. Teresa joined the Health Research Board in 2002, and prior to that she was a researcher in St Vincent's University Hospital in Dublin, and also a scientific director with a biopharma company. After holding numerous senior management roles in the organisation, which is of HRB, Teresa was appointed as Director of Research Strategy and Funding in 2020, where she oversees an annual investment of approximately 50 million in clinical research, population health research and health services research. And in addition, she ensures that the HRB has the policies, strategies and practices to maximise the impact of HRB investments in health research and to demonstrate the value of that impact to all stakeholders. Teresa and her team are currently working with a broad range of national and international stakeholders and alliances to seek to advance critical issues like the reform of research assessment, fair data, open science, access and linkage to healthcare data for research purposes, recognition of diverse research careers and outputs, and bridging the evidence to policy and practice gap. So a very busy portfolio and a range of encompassing related issues, but complex issues for the system and not only for the health research agenda. Prior to taking up her current role in the HRB, Teresa spent time on the secondment in the Department of Health to support the establishment of a new research services and policy unit tasked with supporting evidence-informed decision-making in the department and advancing a broad-based research strategy for the health and social care system. In her role in the HRB, Teresa continues to work closely with the department and the HSE to work towards the common goal of embedding and integrating research into the health and social care system, and that is certainly a very welcome development. Through participation in Impact 2030 implementation structures, Teresa works to ensure that the role, reach and impact of the HRB is optimised within the wider research innovation ecosystem in Ireland. Really, really critically important work, and often the sort of work that happens, and many of us are oblivious to that sort of work happening, but it's so crucial to have that connectivity across the system, as Teresa is such a leader in doing. And just a little bit, she has a BSc in pharmacology from UCD, a PhD from the University of Dundee, and a Master's in Business Practice from the Irish Management Institute. So we're delighted, Teresa, to have you and your expertise. I know from years of being involved with you that you have such expertise across the whole system. I'm really looking forward to your session. So with that, introduce Teresa. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me. I was just saying there a short while ago, it's many, many years actually since I've been on campus. Between COVID, where we just wipe out some years, and being in the Department of Health for 5 years, I really haven't been here in a long, long time. So delighted to be back and to see so much has changed and so much continued growth of the campus. It's absolutely fantastic. Now, I'll see if I can, no. Have I just switched this off? Sorry, just need to pull the thing up to it. Far be it from me to break something the minute I start. I'll make a start anyway. Delighted to be talking about this issue as well. I mean, there's plenty of other issues that I'd love to talk with many of you about, and have already started to, which is probably why this has started a few minutes late. But the issue of, I suppose, research assessment, open research assessment, responsible research assessment, the reform of research assessment has been something that has been, I suppose, very topical in the HRB for many, many years, and therefore that is why I think it was a very seamless task in terms of the discussions around CoARA to be a signatory. It wasn't competitive, and we weren't trying to be the first funding agency past the post, but it just seemed very natural to us, and I hope this will become clear over the course of the conversation today. Maybe before explaining why it's relevant and important to the Health Research Board, I think it's probably important to sort of step back and to step up a bit, which is actually something that CoARA and other alliances and networks allow us to do out of our institutional or organisational bubbles, and indeed out of our island bubbles. So if we look at the global context, certainly, I mean, I've been in the business of funding research and assessing research and funding research and trying to measure impact on research for 20 years or so. And there's been a lot of change in the system. I think the research system, it's much more complex and much more nuanced and multifaceted than it ever was, with many, many actors that you have to, whether you're a funder, whether you're a researcher, whether you're a research manager, whether you're a support staff, it's much more complex to navigate. It's also much more ambitious. It's more outward looking. And it's more collaborative, and it needs to be because of the ambition and also because of the technological advances. I know you had a session on digital health, I think, here as part of your really exciting research week. You've mentioned open science, big data, AI, and the whole move towards interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary methods and skills and ways of working. That doesn't all happen seamlessly and by accident and without being proactive and structured about it. I think something I've noticed is that research funding is now expected to not just generate interesting new knowledge, but to provide solutions to problems, even where it's investigator-led, sometimes even when they say it's blue skies. It's expected that you'd be providing solutions to problems facing society and governments. And I think perhaps even an assumption that you'll start taking steps within the grant towards putting those solutions in action. And we were talking about implementation science there a minute ago, and I think it throws up all of these issues. So a lot of change in the research system, and a lot to get our heads around on the hoof, while also doing what we've always done. Put the economic constraints on that, on public funding, they've multiplied, which of course then leads to political demands, more political demands to do more with less, to demonstrate value, to demonstrate it quicker, and to show the benefit of investing in research. If you throw all of that into the mix, I think it became very clear to us probably about 2 or 3 strategies ago in the HRB, so probably 10 years or so ago, that the issue of research assessment is one of the most significant processes in this global health ecosystem that needs to find its way into the organisational thinking and culture and systems and practices. It has an ability, for good or for bad, to impact on the agenda that you set, on how you assess proposals, on what you value in terms of quality and excellence, in terms of how you go about measuring that and demonstrating it, and on people's careers. And that's just a few of the things. So when you think about it, I suppose it has become obvious to us to actually not having this conversation in a joined up way actually isn't possible and isn't sustainable. If we think about it, like I said, in the HRB context, particularly in our current strategy, woven all the way through probably every single goal and objective element, you'll see elements of some of our actions in research assessment. We probably would, in hindsight, now in the context of the discussions around DORA and CoARA and so on, we don't actually have an action plan, or we don't have a deliverable to have an action plan around this, but actually woven all the way through our strategy and through all of our goals. And we could debate, and we probably will debate in CoARA and elsewhere, what's the best approach to take to make sure that it is truly baked in and into every part of the system. I'm going to assume that most of you know about the Health Research Board, not the wealthiest funding agency in the country, but I think one that has a good reputation, has a significant amount of funding, with probably about 200 million out in the system at any point in time in the area of health research. And as Norelee said, in sort of clinical or patient-oriented health services and systems and policy research and population health research. We try to fund projects, programs. They can be investigator-led, increasingly applied. We sit at the interface of the academic system and the health and social care system, so we're looking both ways all of the time. We're looking at the entire career development framework. We're looking at a framework for those who wish to be doing research in an academic setting totally, those who want to maintain their practice and remain embedded in practice, but also train and develop their research skills. We have an international lens, we have an all-island lens, and as always, again, as we'll discuss today, things like networks, infrastructures, support services, and so on are increasingly, I think, coming onto the agenda and need to come onto the agenda of more funders. Why is this important? Why is this important to the HRB strategy and mission? Well, first and foremost, and I suppose we will always start with this, we want to support quality and excellence. That is absolutely key. However, many of the other issues that I'm going to talk about remind us that we actually need to be quite mindful about what do we mean by quality and what do we mean by excellence, and how do we measure that? And is there a one-fits-all for that? Or as you mentioned, Norelee, in your introduction, different things for different disciplines come into context. And how do you bring that context into it? And again, how can you have kind of purposeful, structured conversations about that and think about that in terms of your processes and practices? Like I've said, we want to incentivize and support diverse career progression. We want to attract people in, and we want to help them progress for lots of different reasons and in lots of different ways, coming from lots of different settings and lots of different situations and circumstances. I think we want to assess researchers based both on their individual contribution, but increasingly, I think one of the areas that I'd say, not that we're grappling with, but we always have to think about and improve is how do we acknowledge team contributions? So that we have like the number of collaborations on a grant now. They've just, you can look at international trends on it, and we're actually doing a piece of work at the moment on it to sort of see the changes over time of collaborations in any given grant. And it's just changed beyond belief. Well, how do you reward all of those people? And what do you look for by way of information? Because you do want to reward them. And then at the same time, people are going, oh, Jesus, that form is so long. Do we really have to give you 50 CVs? But how do you assess them? How do you recognize it if you don't? And what information should you get from them? So I think with each issue, it throws up another issue in terms of the assessment process. And that's just at the assessment of research application stage. We want to recognise and reward a broad range of outputs. The day and age of looking at publications and publications only, and peer-reviewed publications and journal publications, that has long gone. Not everywhere, and I guess that's why we're having this conversation. But certainly, we're trying to generate forms and CVs and processes whereby there's a much broader range, acknowledged and those contributions form part of the assessment process. Promote a culture of diversity, inclusion and research integrity, both within the teams that apply, but importantly within the research protocols themselves. This is probably most obvious to us in the HRB in our clinical trials funding, trials and healthcare interventions funding, where we're really trying to make a big sort of push at guidance note and application stage to say, have you thought about your sampling? Have you thought about representativeness? Are they the easy to get group? Which is very tempting, and I can, as a researcher, I can understand it. But actually, in terms of the outcome at the other end, it could be very structured and randomized and statistically significant. But actually, think about the inclusiveness within that. Bridge the evidence to practice gap. This has been something that we have spent a lot on. So you will see many of our grants looking for knowledge user involvement and right at an early stage and as part of the application. I think it started as let's work on dissemination, but actually we've come right back up the pike in terms of actually co-designing, and maybe even something that we've talked about is perhaps do we need even funding before grant applications come in to help people with research agenda setting and prioritization and co-designing in that stage, not to be sort of trying to get a grant where you're going to do that as the first part of it and then maybe being unsuccessful. And transparency and trust. I hope most of you will be familiar with the HRB investment in PPA Ignite and the huge emphasis that we put on that. We want to promote and support the open science agenda. I think we are doing that. We were we're the only funder in Ireland that has an open research platform, and we've got huge support from the research community in relation to that, and I think that's been very successful. We're very linked in now to the discussions at Europe around what the European open science platform, that is the equivalent of what we have in the HRB Open platform, and the scope for that to be available to people nationally, not just those that get funded through Europe. And I suppose one of the things we're grappling currently with is actually how do we acknowledge and recognise at grant application stage the contribution and the practices of those applicants in the open science space. And we keep going around in a little bit of a spin on that, and it's a conversation that we will be having with many of you because, and it's a conversation we've started with some of our CoARA partners already, like, do you get stuck into that at the assessment of grant application stage, or do you do that as part of kind of monitoring, and do you do it at an institutional level, or do you do it at an individual grant level? And I think particularly as we're in a situation where we haven't bedded down our infrastructure, our systems, our supports at institutional and at kind of Ireland Inc. level in relation to making this the easy thing to do for people. It seems there's a time and a place to introduce these things into your assessment processes as well. And it doesn't. We want to promote it, we want to incentivise it, we want to fund it, but is it the right time to be building that into the assessment of applications? I'm just sharing with you some of the questions, I suppose, that they're very practical questions that get thrown up from us. And I suppose I'm trying to, probably nothing on the list when we talk about EDI, open science, PPI, so nothing surprises you and everybody agrees that these are the issues that we should be talking about in DORA or CoARA or on any other networks. But actually, when you start to get into them, you start to see they're interwoven, and a decision on one has an impact on other. And it's also not just assessment for us isn't at the grant application stage. It's at perhaps maybe some things we get into at contracting, for those that have been successful, and you don't wreck the heads of the 80%, unfortunately, who haven't got funded. Do you do it during the lifetime of the grant, kind of in-life discussions? Or do you do it as part of your broader evaluation at an institutional level? So and how does one feedback into the other? I'm going to skip through this for a minute in the interest of time, but these are the types of things that I suppose on a day-to-day basis across the grant life cycle, we would say why. What sort of things, I suppose, have we been doing? Well, we signed the DORA Declaration, or the San Francisco Declaration, many years ago, and we have found the DORA Funders Discussion Group just invaluable. absolutely invaluable. A really safe place for experimentation, for learning, for sharing resources, very practical resources on that. We'll soon make available some of our pilot analysis that we've done on that and use of narrative CVs, where we've done it for a couple of different groups now. The numbers aren't huge, but we've kind of looked across the career stage and applied it, and then asked the researchers how did they find it, filling out the narrative CV in the process and so on, and what additional helps and supports could they use. Interestingly, we've asked the reviewers. The researchers on board say it'd be great if we had more resources, and we'll get better at it as we go along, and so on and so forth. But reviewers, surprisingly perhaps to us, a lot of reviewers who still really weren't that clued in about the whole issue of narrative CVs and the research assessment process. So it'll be interesting to see if CoARA and DORA and the kind of the momentum that brings and the outreach globally, will that shift and will that change? It has to. I suppose is what we're saying. So only this morning I signed, there's expressions of interest going into CoARA at the moment for working groups and for hosting national chapters and so on. And so the HRB has joined up with a funders group who are going to look at the issue with Science Europe and with Commission, and there's a nice body of funders in there who are going to look at what information should we collect in applications across a whole pile of different schemes, and is there something we should be thinking about different when we're securing reviewers, and what guidance and assistance or instruction do we give them, and how do we assess that? So that's something that's very live for us, because you can fill out narrative CVs till the cows come home, but if the reviewers who are assessing the proposals aren't on board, aren't getting it, don't find it useful for some, not for others, if they're on their computer separately, like Googling away, well, then we have to have that conversation. Other things I've listed here, I'm not going to go through them all individually, but again, all because we've been thinking about a fair assessment process, and a level playing field, and a diverse outputs and diverse researchers. So we have a JET plan, we have a new EDI committee, and like I said, we focused on research protocols. Importantly, and I think this is one that I think in a national conversation, and that's the other, I think, expression of interest that I'm aware of anyway, there may be more that have gone into CoARA there's a national community or a national chapter from Ireland that is submitting a proposal. So certainly on the funder side, there's the HRB and SFI, and I know IUA, TIA, and I think I'm assuming the higher education institutions that have signed up to it will be in there. I'm really looking forward to that and getting stuck into some of these discussions, and I think that's a real advantage, because we've been in Science Europe talking to funders about these things for years, but actually what's really attractive about this is actually, and we come back and then we try and put subgroups of, we'll talk to a small group of the research offices, we'll put a focus group of the researchers. Actually, we can do a lot more through this, so I hope that comes through. But one of the things that I think has been very evident for us, maybe because we're funding into the health and social care setting, but probably not just because of that, is recognising the diverse roles. So the kind of, I'm going to call it the non-traditional research roles. And we would fund, we never know what salary scale, so people sort of say, what salary scale? We go, I don't know, find one in your organisation, because this is kind of pushing the boat out a little bit as you do new things, and you need different types of people on your team, and you need people to support the team. There's all sorts of manager, coordinator, support services roles, and I think that's something that I think collectively in Ireland we need to think through, and because this is critical to this research assessment agenda that we're talking about here, and we're also looking at all sorts of alternatives and adaptations to peer review, particularly when you've a really big scheme. When you've got a scheme, maybe like our investigator-led projects, and you know in your head what quality and excellence and so on means, and you're going through peer review, but it's a huge exercise, and you do get to a point where actually there's a lot of people end up on the same, in and around the same score. What do you do? So they're types of issues that we're looking at. We do not promote or use rankings or journal-based metrics in anything that we do. And again, this is just more examples of I'm trying to point to very practical things that this gets us into in terms of ORCID and persistent identifiers. And the reason I kind of clustered these in a tree is because one of the dilemmas that you always have as a funder is people say, Jesus, the act of putting a grant application in is like, I need to take 3 months out of my life. And you're right, it is. And on the other hand, many of the things that we've talked about, as we move now to narrative-based CVs, as opposed to maybe just doing your kind of printout of some of the stuff that you would already have had, you want to recognise all of the different contributions that people are making. Some are researchers, some are not. You want to get into the whole how it's relevant and how you've co-designed the question, how the knowledge users and others involved are actually going to make a difference through it. You typically then have some sort of coordination or governance structure that you have to describe. You know, and then if you're going to get information on everybody on the team, that part of the form is like that, and we know it's a head wreck for everybody. But if you remove that, then people say to you, we really need to measure that. We really want the contribution measured. We really want that in. So I think we all collectively have to figure out where the sweet spot is and where the sweet spot is for particular schemes. So that's something that we have identified for this year. And, you know, I suppose, you know, you could call it shortening the application form. For me, I like thinking about the application form in the context of the research assessment agenda. What is right? What is fit for purpose? And we're also looking at our annual reporting and our even things like grant variations and things like that, or end of grant reporting, so that everything that you give to us on a data system is banked and you build on that the next time round. And we haven't done that in the past. It's been really inefficient, and I know it's something that we really, really need to improve. I'm going to skip past them, and I've probably made some of these reflections already, so if I have, I'm not going to repeat them. But I suppose just thinking about what does it mean in reality for us? Well, some reflections, I think, on this particular agenda. I think huge potential for improvement, for change, for helping people be more productive overall, because they're spending time on the things that matter. So definitely change needed in the system, and huge potential there. I think we're very comfortable in the HRB with there isn't necessarily one way to do everything. So I think it's what feels right for an organisation. It feels whatever's right for a school or for a discipline or for a scheme or for an initiative. So it's constantly remembering, what are we trying to do here? And does it feel right and proportionate to it? Any opportunity to work together towards common goals, I think is just great. I mean, as an organisation, we shifted literally overnight from being a funder of basic biomedical, basic and applied biomedical, to a change in our statutory remit, where you're told you're funding patient-oriented health services research and population health research. I was there at the time, I can tell you, and as a pharmacologist, like we had limited experience in population health and health services research. We had a toe in the water probably with doctors and a bit of fellowship funding for nurses, but it was a big change, and you probably remember some of that journey, Norelee, as we were trying to do that. So it hasn't happened easily, it hasn't happened quickly. It is a marathon, not a sprint, but actually I think because of that, we had to recruit a whole different type of staff that we had. And retrain and upskill a lot of people as well. So you need to think about the stuff that happens under the bonnet. Just because you say you're going to change doesn't mean that you're going to change. You do actually have to think about your systems, your practices, your processes, and your own staff, and think about your training in that sense. I think simplification and harmonisation is something that is a potential here. But more importantly for me, alignment and coordination. Piloting, this is, like I said, experimentation, learning. The groups in terms of Science Europe, DORA, and I know it will follow through in relation to CoARA, is a real safe space for trialling things. And for example, we haven't gone the narrative CV for all of our co-applicants on grants yet, but we know SFI are about to introduce that. So we're linking very closely with them, but saying, you do it as a pilot and we'll learn from you. We're not going to do it, but we're also not going to just jump on the bandwagon and say we're going to do it. We're going to wait and see, because it may or it may not work, and it may or may not be well received and effective. And like I said, at a very practical level, both from DORA and already even the discussions having on CoARA, very practical tools, frameworks, code of practice, guidelines, templates, systems and so on that you can use. And I've already mentioned the national communities that are in discussion and an expression of interest gone in from Ireland. So I suppose to conclude, I mean, these are reflections, or I suppose they could potentially be challenges. You can flip it whichever way you want. I think for me this is about being informed about what we're doing and keeping it at the top of our mind, and not just getting carried away and saying, well, we did this for this, so we're going to do this for everything else. Proportionate. So how can we be proportionate? Because on the one hand, we want to recognise all these contributions. On the other hand, you'll be 6 months writing your grant application if we get you and need all of that information. So we have to find a place where it is proportionate to what we're doing. And we can't have an application form that size for a summer scholarship of 8 weeks. You know, so what is proportionate and what does that mean? Evolution, not revolution. So I know that, you know, in terms of the ERA priorities in Europe, the discussions have already started about what are the next priorities. You know, of the 20 and Ireland picked 10, whoa, what are the next ones? And I don't know what you guys are like, but in the HRB we're going, whoa, hang on a minute. Actually, things are really only starting to gear up, and we won't, you know, we're only really starting to get ourselves into the priorities that we've signed up to. It's not about throwing metrics out the door, it's about responsible use of metrics and being clear what you're using and why. A final point I'd like to make is, because I've had this conversation you know, with colleagues in my own organisation, there is an element, when you talk about being proportionate, when you talk about experimentation and learning, when you talk about maybe going on a journey, but maybe a bit down the line going, oh, did it quite work? We go, that doesn't sit well necessarily always within organisations. Maybe it's different within a higher education institution, but I'd hazard a guess, you know, in terms of a governance perspective, in terms of heads of schools and further up from that, maybe not. So we live, and certainly in a public sector agency that works directly to the minister, we live in a time where compliance and accountability is absolutely and utterly key. And so often that can make the risk appetite low. And you're trying to explain that you're not trying to dumb things down, you're trying to improve it. But that's just my own reflection. That's actually harder than you think to have that conversation upwards. So that's just something I'd leave out there. And then my final point, which is a really important one, and this is why I end on it all of the time. This doesn't happen without being planned in, being programmed in, being part of people's jobs, and time given to it, and developing the people that you also want to take this forward. So it is time intensive. You need people with particular skills, and you need the systems in order, if we're talking about open science, we're talking about open data, you know, if we talk about shared resources and supports for narrative CVs and so on, it needs investment. That's really what I'm saying. And it's not investment that typically comes through individual grants. And in truth, you don't really want to fund things like that by sort of ad hoc, time-limited grants. So we need to have this conversation, back to this national chapter, at a macro institutional Ireland Inc. level with the various government departments. And we need to acknowledge and invest in people and the systems for assessment, from people like like Ashling in the library here, to people working in governance, coordination, and in terms of evaluation. They're not on a researcher scale. They're often not on the sort of typical staffing scales. We need different people to do different jobs, and we need to find a way and a funding model to resource them. Otherwise, we will have really interesting conversations, and we will have quality improvement, and we will change things, but it won't be sustained. We won't really have changed the dial. Thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Teresa. Pleasure as always to listen to, and I think so much resonates there with what you've described, the risk appetite, the importance of the system working together, and I do agree with you, and I would just like to acknowledge and applaud the HRB, which in my view, having a kind of a view across the landscape, I find you a particularly funding agency is particularly keen to reflect, explore, work together, and to really see how the system can be bettered by us all working together. So I do agree with you, I think the opportunity for that national chapter, but also the wider engagement, is what's needed to provide a sustainable approach to what we fund and how we fund it, and to ensure that that's something that the system develops. So I just want to acknowledge that with you. It's fantastic. So looking forward to our discussion later. Now, at this point, I'd like to introduce Dr Yensi Flores Bueso, who is joining us today from work that she's doing between the cancer research at UCC and also the Protein Design Institute at the University of Washington in Seattle. And Yensi is doing that as a passionate molecular biologist who is working on developing novel bacteria-delivered cancer therapeutics through that collaboration, and has secured that through an MSCA Mary Skłodowski-Curie Award, and that's a global initiative postdoc fellowship. So congratulations to Yensi on that. But outside of that, or within all of that, you're also very committed to promotion of inclusion, diversity, equality and access in academia through science policy, outreach and communication. And she's leveraged her access to the platforms provided through networks and memberships such as the Global Young Academy and her new appointment to the Young Academy of Ireland. So congratulations to you on that. It's a very welcome initiative. And her role as a steering member of the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, or CoARA. So it's great to have you here today, Yensi. And just speak a little bit about your role as a member of the Global Young Academy. You've led international science education projects and initiatives that challenge the concept of scientific excellence and current research assessment systems. And you currently coordinate the publication of the largest study currently underway, investigating research assessment practices across 141 institutions from 56 countries in 6 continents. It's a fantastic piece of work. Organises wide audience discussion and panel to debate the topic of scientific excellence. And you also advocate for research assessment practices that promote idea and meet the needs of early career researchers worldwide through your role on such entities as the Steering Board for CoARA. And as a member of the first cohort of the Young Academy of Ireland, she aims to engage in transdisciplinary research that assesses and overcomes barriers towards building diverse and equitable Irish research institutions, and engage in science policy and science communication to promote a scientific culture that values research integrity, open science and collaboration. So Yensi, really looking forward to your talk. It's great to have you here with us today. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to you now.
I just want to apologize if I forget my English. I have a bit of a jet lag. So in advance, sorry. Thank you. Okay. So I'm really happy and honored to be here, and in this discussion, I'm a big fan of Teresa. I got to know her earlier, and I'm really impressed by her all the time, how knowledgeable, and it's really, really nice to see someone like Teresa managing the funds at HRB. It's really inspiring. So I hope that my talk will be as interesting, but it's from a different perspective because, as you know, I'm a postdoc, so I'm an early career researcher. So I look at these changes, from a perspective that is different from a funder. So how did I become involved in this? I'm a molecular biologist. I know very little about research assessment, and I'm learning in every opportunity that I have. But so it happens, I'm a Honduran, and I've had the opportunity to work in research institutions that are advanced or research institutions that are just starting, like in my home country in Honduras. And throughout all this experience working in these different institutions, I learned how these practices of research assessment negatively impact researchers, institutions, and funding agencies. This because these practices only focus on a narrow set of criteria or metrics that act like that are like judging a book by its cover, you know. It only tells us about the appearances of a researcher or appearances of a group of researchers. It doesn't really look into essential attributes that for research. For example, integrity, openness, collaboration, and other personal qualities such as curiosity, passion for science, and social engagement. Now, I'm the kind of person that if feels that something is not wrong, I need to do something about it. So I engage in different organizations, you know, to make my contributions towards something. So for this, I was able to secure a membership in the Global Young Academy, which is a global network of researchers. It's about 100 countries represented in that academy. And here I started co-leading the Scientific Excellence Working Group. As mentioned earlier, the working group is about define what scientific excellence means. Because, you know, what I've learned so far is that, and I've become aware, is that excellence means something different depending on the context. It's not, there is no a standard of excellence. And in this working group, I started engaging in this research study where we look into 238 policies from 141 institutions in 56 countries. And here we found that most of these institutions rely very heavily on these metrics, which is detrimental for everyone. So being aware of that, you know, we learned, and I was really happy to know, that the European Commission in 2020 identified also that this narrow set of criteria, it's a barrier towards progress of research. And as an outcome of that, they said, okay, we need to make a consultation into different groups to see what is it that we need to change. So as a member of the GYA, we became really involved in this, and we were part of the stakeholders that were like answering to the European Commission and everything. And we become very involved. So leading the European Commission learned, as Teresa mentioned, you know, that research assessment needs to change to appreciate collaboration and openness, appreciate diversity of outputs in research, and start using more evaluating more the quality of research and the integrity of research rather than quantities, which is what metrics tells us. It tells us like amount of work that has supposedly been done, but it doesn't tell you like how well it was done, or if it was done using a really good integrity. So as an outcome of this, the European Commission said, okay, this requires a systemic cultural change involving all the institutions, funders, and researchers. And this came out in the stakeholder consultation report, in the scoping report in November 2021, which included the opinions of more than 359 organizations from 40 countries, including those of the GYA. This included actually more than 12 organizations. I know that the HRB was very involved in this. So it's something to keep in mind that this the report has all the input of research institutions in Ireland. So, you know, after that agreement came, then it came, okay, so there's a general agreement of what needs to change by all the member institutions that participate in this report. And it brings forward, you know, what is it that we need to change and how are we going to achieve this? So the overarching principles of this agreement produced by all these organizations is that we have to respect autonomy of organizations. Ethics and integrity needs to be at heart. We need to assess the quality, and we need to recognize the diversity of research activities, practices, and outputs that have in research. So the main commitments, there are 10 commitments in this agreement. So the first 4 are to recognize the diversity of contributions, and 2, to abandon the irresponsible use of metrics. There are 6 supporting commitments on how we're going to achieve this. And 3 of these are about developing the systems, or like the tools that we need to assess research. And 3 of them are to see how we come together and actually share this knowledge and communicate with each other. So the key characteristics of these agreements is that it's flexible and evolutive, respectful of autonomy. It has a time frame, so once an organization signs the agreement, after a year, they will kind of self-report, what is their state and what is it that they want to improve, that it's more of a priority for each institution. And in 5 years' time, the organizations shall demonstrate to its peers that, to their peers, that they have made some progress towards it. So, who can sign the agreement? Any organization that is non-for-profit that is involved in research. And as of April 21st, 523 organizations have signed. So, now, after the agreement, one of the main outputs of the agreement is that we needed a platform to share, to move forward. And this is how CoARA was launched, an independent organization of those who have signed the agreement and that want to contribute to advanced research assessment. So the first, CoARA was launched on the 1st of December of 2022, where over 300 member organizations voted to formally adopting the CoARA governance documents, elected the Coalition Steering Board, improving the preliminary work plan, and also selected European Science Foundation as the secretariat. So, as of the 21st of April of 2023, as I mentioned, 522 organizations have signed the agreement, and CoARA has 446 members so far. And most of them are universities and associations, but we also have research centers and institutions, academies and societies, and funding organizations, among others. From Ireland, most research performing organizations have signed, and as founders, we have the HRB and SFI. I think HRB was one of the first signing bodies of Ireland, actually. So it is the mission of CoARA to enable systemic reform of assessment by providing a platform where members can discuss what can be done, like how to improve research assessment. So I see CoARA as joining like the improving research assessment Twitter. You can read the news and you can comment and see, oh, this doesn't work for me, or this works for me, or this can be implemented in different scenarios. But what we know, is that there is no one size fits all. Every organization will, in every case, research assessment will be different. It will be different from country to country, from organization to organization, from what is evaluated. It will be different depending on the jobs or for example, the description that a person will be doing, the roles of a person, for example. So the coalition bodies, the General Assembly of Members, which is the highest level of decision making. And it meets like annually, where like the main decisions are made and voted by all the members of the coalition. Then the steering board, which is elected and is responsible for the oversight of the coalition. The working groups and national chapters are the most important part of the coalition, because these are the entities that will bring up the knowledge to move forward research assessment. And the coalition secretariat, which supports the administration. Now, the steering board is an impressive group of researchers who have a lot of experience in research assessment, except me. I'm new, but I'm learning every day. But I became really involved in this CoARA, and I actually, applied to be voted to be member of the steering board, because I thought, research assessment impacts first early career researchers. They're the most impacted. So there needs to be a voice representing early career researchers. And thankfully, I have the platforms to be representing these voices in the steering board. Now I do it through the GYA. For example, I as a co-lead of the group, of the Scientific Excellence Working Group, I post any questions about it, and I ask for comments or feedback about different things. It's not me. I'm not saying that I'm the most knowledgeable here, but I do bring the experiences of early career researchers worldwide. And also, I am happy now that I can bring also the experiences of the Young Academy of Ireland, of the members who I met yesterday. So now there is a first call for working groups and national chapters, as Teresa mentioned. And I'm really looking forward to see all the national groups and working groups that are going to come from Ireland. So as I mentioned earlier, the working groups are the platform to learn and generate knowledge and to discuss and develop new tools for research assessment. It's the opportunity that we have to advance research assessment, all the members of CoARA. There are three common types of working groups. The working groups of interest, the communities of interest, which they take some topics. Then, as Teresa was mentioned, discipline communities, which is for criteria for specific disciplines. And then there is institution committees, of which the HRB is going to be part of, I think. It's depending on the type of organization, for example, funders, or universities, or academies, etc. And the national chapters, which will support that discussion and mutual learning of CoARA in issues that are specific to a country. The difference, now, there's a process for application, which is a bit, I find it a bit complicated, but for national chapters, it's not. I think there's a deadline every month, so you can apply anywhere. The only thing is that it needs to involve at least half of the CoARA members of the country, the national chapter, which, it makes it inclusive. So the call process, which I mentioned, is a bit complicated, but it's open right now. So the first step is that the point of contact, to get a point of contact set up, which is the member who signed the agreement fills a form saying, okay, you can share my data or my contact, with other organizations. And then a database of this point of contacts, it's open. And you can contact other organizations that might have similar interest as yours. And then you have to submit an expression of interest. I think the next week is the deadline. But it has to be 3 organizations that sign this expression of interest. And then this will be opened up between the point of contacts. And then and you can submit later the final draft of your proposal, but it has to be 5 organizations. And among the points that are required is that you include researchers from different stages in their careers. I think it might be different with funders, but yeah, in the interest, communities of interest. And yeah, more information, you can find it in that website. You can take a picture. They will explain better in that website. So now, what am I working on and what are the next steps in the steering board? So right now we're waiting for the results of the WIDERA call, which is a grant application that we submitted to support the funding of the coalition and the working group, the work and the funding that funds the working groups, and also to establish some cascade funding, for members that want to apply for something, for like, I don't know, implementing, exploring an implementation of something, or want to collaborate. For example, one member that has tried something, like the HRB, is very knowledgeable. And maybe they want to teach someone in Costa Rica, for example, how they have implemented, and they can apply for this funding to support this interaction, and that funding should be available when we get the wider call. So the call for working groups, which is now open, and we're preparing for the General Assembly, which will take place on the 23rd of June. And organizing other CoARA's activities, and establishing some synergies and dialogues. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention, and it's my pleasure. Thank you.
So this one on there, yeah, she's great. I'll invite Teresa and Ashling and Yensi just to join me up here. And I have some questions to start us off, but before I do that, I'm just going to introduce Ashling Hayes, who hasn't had her bio announced yet. Ashling will be familiar to many of you, but she's the head of research services at the Glucksman Library here at UL. And as head of research services, Ashling oversees a team who are responsible for delivering and developing, I suppose, specialist innovative services to faculty and researchers, and they do that very well, I must say. And this covers things like research data management, bibliometrics, research impact, research collections development, and also evidence-based research methods, including systematic reviewing. And I think it's fair to say Ashling's particular interest around things like open science and communication. So we're delighted to have you joining us as well, Ashling. So we will take questions from the audience, and I'm not sure how we manage them online, but I just want to kind of start off, I suppose, by, I think I'd come maybe to you first, Teresa. I suppose, by its nature, health research is very, I suppose, collaborative, engaged, participatory. Do you think there's an opportunity for a funder like the HRB or kind of health research funders in general to take a lead on particular aspects of this kind of research assessment reform? Do you think something naturally lends itself? And I was wondering, particularly as you talked about team collaboration, for example, are there elements there you think that in this wide, busy, complex environment that the HRB or health funders can lead on in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think building on what I touched on there, I think by our very nature, by design, we're at the interface. We're not, I suppose, a research council per se facing in one direction. Health is just becoming even more inter and transdisciplinary than it ever was, and it always was. Maybe it took us a while to cotton on to that, but I mean, it's increasingly so. And particularly, I suppose, what I would find it, we've always been looking at how do we do things with the university and the health system and with the training bodies. I mean, that's on the career side, I think we've always been in that. And we've been a bit of an outlier, as I well know, because usually the one getting the letters saying, where did you come up with that scale? And, and you're kind of going, well, one doesn't exist. We have to find one. And constantly trying to push that with other government departments who say, that's not the IUA scale. And That's not the HSE scale. Where did you get this? So we've always been in that kind of boundary spanning space and had to take the case of we need to do whatever we need to do to make this work. So I think that's kind of in our DNA in the organisation. I think one of the areas where I would notice now, again, and you'll see it in our strategy, where it's a new area for us, but it's an area that we have to figure it out, and it has brought us in contact with a whole pile of other players, and that is the data space, the data for health research, but the data for research generally, and how do we make sure that we use and reuse and optimise the use of data that is collected in the health and social care system anyway for research purposes, as well as the conversation that we would be having with all researchers about how do we make your data managed, fair and as open as possible. So this, certainly as an organisation, this has thrown us into all sorts of places that we've never been before, that we don't particularly have a whole pile of competency. We're trying to learn fast, but it's bringing us into contact. We're an organisation that realises what we want to do, but we know when we don't necessarily have the skills or the history or the experience, we're not afraid to ask for help. And so we're finding ourselves with research centres and teams and roles and technologies and legislation and people in that space that we've never worked with before. But if we don't, we're not going to succeed in this. So I think I would find when I'm sitting around the table with other funders that some of these things that make research happen and makes them happen easier and is going to be the step change in it. We're certainly involved in those discussions and bringing that, I suppose, maybe mindset and culture. And if a little bit of that can rub off and we can bring, I mean, we're probably now closer in the data and the technology and the AI and the big data space with SFI than we have ever been in a health research conversation. And I say that in a positive way, not in any sort of a critical way. But actually, we're coming closer and closer and closer on so many issues where we spent decades in Ireland wondering, did we have too many funding agencies, too many quangos, and actually could we streamline everything, or did we have too much? We all know that we have our own, it's a bit like the research assessment exercise. We all know we have things to do, and they were different, and we need to be good at it. But actually, there's a hell of a lot that we have in common, and we're actually in a position now to help each other out way more than we ever were in the past.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Teresa. Like, you've got such understanding of the landscape, such a perspective on it. But you're absolutely right. There was a time, I think you're right, people went just one funding agency and it would be absolutely fine. And no, that's not what's needed at all, because I think the understanding, particularly that you have and the HRB have around the various the stakeholders, people you engage with, and what's different there is needed, because some of it becomes too broad, too big. And do you think what you're posing there, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about the new research bill and all that's going on at the moment, and I appreciate the HRB isn't obviously part of that, but the whole ecosystem, as you say, needs to work optimally and work together. And I see Ashling is nodding profusely at me when we talk about data management and fair data. There's library services, there's a whole element of the system, and it can almost get too big to handle in some respects. So I'm curious the way you've observed that, yes, you're working much more closely with SFI, for example, than you may traditionally have done. And do you think some of the opportunity that arose through COVID, particularly like the rapid response cause, has maybe enabled some of that easier working together, or would it have happened anyway?
I think we were able to respond quickly in COVID with other partners, but actually certainly working with IRC for the HRB has been something that we've done for many years now, and it just feels absolutely and utterly right and natural. So I think we built on that. It didn't happen because of it. I think we do. We work closely, increasingly closely with SFI. I think probably interesting now. We're looking at doing a piece of work around building on learning from COVID, which is we need to look at our capability and capacity and systems around public health modelling is an example, and that's an area now where we're going, well, we kind of bring the public health dimension, but we don't from a modelling and most of the investment in data scientists and technology and modelling capability, they're probably in other centres within institutions, probably in schools and faculties that we don't interact with, many of them funded by SFI, and we're losing them to health, or we're not training them in the areas we want. So that's an area where I think it's been quite beneficial in that instance. Like a lot of things in Ireland, things come down to people. no matter what structures and systems you have. So certainly having had a good working relationship with Philip Nolan as the new DG of SFI has stood us in good stead, and that's quite different. But I think to the issue that you're raising, I think what we haven't cracked yet, I mean, for me, like, you know, I mean, yes, we're not involved in the research bill. I think DFERS, by necessity, is focusing a lot of its time and attention on doing that because it has a big job of work to do in relation to that. It's probably taken more other time when there's an opportunity cost, I suppose, is what I'm saying in relation to it. But I think the thing that we haven't quite cracked, and it's a discussion for Impact 2030, which is the strategy that unites us all. But I'm not entirely sure that we've cracked to how do we do the infrastructure and the systems and the processes that are actually truly Ireland Inc. And putting that in a national, sustained way, where actually, even if we all contribute into the pot, I mean, and I think, and I'll hush now. I mean, if I think of, for example, what we did around research and integrity, you know, we got together in relation to that, and we all agreed that this needed to be done, and that we're going to align ourselves with the kind of, you know, NREO and the ALIA guidance and so on. And so then we all threw into the pot. So we're all doing the same thing, and we all threw into the pot. So it's not even that we need a kind of it would be great if there's a central kind of pot and a benefactor that would come and say, you know, what needs to happen in relation to, you know, probably North, some of the North projects are probably the first example of that. I know the funding for those has been argued hard got, and it's just, it's really welcome, but we need to do more of that, and we need to do it in a sustainable way. But also there is scope for us all to sit and put our hands in our pockets and put a little bit out, because sometimes it's not the money, it's to know that it's going to be sustained, because we can do things in grants, and our board will sign off on grants that are maybe 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, whatever. But actually what you want to say is we're going to bake it into the institutions, and we're going to fund you to do this for our perspective, the hospitals in particular, and other healthcare settings, and then higher education institutions. So that's the dial that we haven't hit quite yet, I think, in Ireland.
It's a great reason. We could spend a lot of time having that specific discussion about the how and what's needed maybe across the system. And it's so valuable. And you've all mentioned people, and I want to come to you now, Yensi, just talking about early career researchers, and we know that people are so important. You saw the HRP strategy you've mentioned repeatedly, but you mentioned the vulnerability, I think, and that's my word, not yours, of early career researchers in the whole research reform agenda, our discussion. Can you maybe extrapolate or pull that out a little bit more? I imagine it's because you're saying they're like the people who are probably going to experience this more than the rest of us, seasoned older folk who are longer in the system and have got further along perhaps with a different system. Is that what you're kind of thinking about, Jens? Or maybe elaborate more on that point.
So yeah, we're still starting in this system. And, you know, there's precarity in research institutions, as we all know. But, you know, we're starting and we're like pushed towards this, it's kind of like a hamster on a wheel, you know, just publish, and we don't even know why are we publishing. As I remember the words of Eva saying, who is a steering board member also, you know, research, we didn't become researchers to publish. We become researchers because we want to make an impact, a difference in society. We want to solve some of the pressing issues of society and advance it. So I think that it's important that we step back and realize, you know, what is it that we're passionate about? Why are we doing this research that we're so passionate about? How do we achieve this impact? So if we step back and okay, if I want a job, I need to publish 10 papers by the end of these 2 years, maybe publishing 10 papers is not as impactful, you know. Maybe it's better if you do something like science outreach, or like communicate with the public, or engage in in some other way, so that your research area can become more visible or more understandable by the public or other members of the research environment. Yeah, so I guess that.
No, you are right, the totality of contribution being recognised, and maybe that there's different stages of career where that can be emphasised more and not realising only in one particular aspect, which can drive certain practices. I think it's a very good point, Yensi, thank you for that. Ashling, if I come to you now, and you've been listening to the discussion, and there's loads of points, what has been resonating with you, and I suppose thinking particularly about the academic publishing aspect of research assessment?
I think the first thing when we think about academic publishing is what actually are we doing when we're publishing, and what academic publishing is, and what are the roles of people within it. So when we're publishing, and I know you just said we don't want to be publishing all the time, but really when you're doing research, you're trying to meet the widest audience as possible. And that's what we've looked for academic publishing to do, and academic publishers to do with us. Their job is dissemination. And then we look at the roles in it and what the academic and the researcher actually does within that system. And they provide the research, they do the peer review, they're generally the editors in it. So they're doing a huge amount of work within it. They have a huge amount of control of what goes out. And yet their power is very low within that system because they are linked so tightly to a very narrow set of metrics when it comes to assessment. They have very little power, even though they're doing all of the work. And from my point of view, we've often said that, you know, as someone who works in the administration side and in the support of it, and has that more bird's eye view with working with publishers at, you know, doing deals with them as regards subscriptions, we say that the people who can make the change here really and who can stop this are the researchers, because they're the ones who are publishing. But they're caught on that hamster wheel. And that's an issue. And this is where CoARA can come in and kind of be that disruptor that it can do. It can say, well, now we can provide a different path, and we can give you back that power over the publishing process. That can happen. And that's quite clear, and it's been recognised by the European Commission as, you know, linking both the reform of research assessment with our open science objectives, that those two need to go together. So it is a big unknown. What will happen? Exactly what will publishing look like in 5, 10, 15 years? But what I do hope is that academics and researchers will have a lot more control over it, that they will own their own copyright, that they will be able to distribute their own research among their students and not be afraid that I'm actually breaking the law here.
That's really interesting, Ashling, isn't it? And you think about, when you put it like that with your helicopter bird's eye view, you know, when you're in the middle of the process, you kind of get into the process. You've signed the copyright piece, and it's fascinating to listen to you describe it as that, taking back the power and the opportunity you see for CoARA and helping us to do that. So I think your observation of being a significant disruptor is actually very valuable, and I do hope it is. And maybe back to publishing houses and more ownership of the actual knowledge, and then thinking about what that knowledge does for society and how we actually have true impact. And these agendas go back to the basics of what they're actually attempting to do. So thank you for that, Ashling. I was going to pause. Any questions or observations from the audience at the moment? If anyone is reflecting on our discussions and have any observations. If not, I'll move on while you're thinking. Oh yeah, gentleman over here. Thank you.
Not a big observation or insightful contribution, just more of a practical question about CoARA and the processes with the working groups. So just earlier today, so I'm working with Ashling in the library on the implementation side of all these things. We were discussing with our performing arts researchers about new ways of gathering their outputs, their arts portfolios and so on, and how to measure that. And so this kind of discussion has a strong implication for research assessment at some point down the line. But we felt this working group proposal comes a bit too early for us to get involved, because we are a little bit fuzzy yet how to do all this. Will this come again? What is the process over time with these working groups?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and it's actually something that I forgot in the presentation, and I apologize. So even if you don't make the deadline for this working group, there will be another call in October, on fall. So whatever you didn't submit, you can have it ready for the next call. There's the duration of the working groups will depend on the project. So I think the calls of the working groups, that we're going to always have them open. So yeah, please do. Yeah, it's an excellent topic. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks. Now, just kind of, I suppose, an open question to all of you, and thinking particularly about equality, diversity, and inclusion and access, as you are an advocate for, Yensi. You know, where, and I think we picked some of these threads, but just to think about it, you talked about it, Teresa's point of view of the participants in research studies and making sure that, and I understood exactly what you meant. You know, we have a lovely, well-controlled, randomised trial, and actually you've excluded probably 90% of the patients who turn up into a clinic. And you know, your results are fabulous, but they probably apply to a subpopulation. So that's one aspect of the EDI aspect. Where else do you think, I suppose, CoARA and that wider conversation on reform research assessment can help with the EDI agenda from all of your perspectives? What are your thoughts or reactions to that?
So first of all, CoARA, it's open to have members from everywhere in the planet. So although most institutions right now are from Europe, because you know it was, after all, a European initiative, we're seeing more organizations from Africa, in Latin America, for example, coming into CoARA. And I think that is very important that this is open and that we are welcoming the perspectives of each country outside of Europe, because as different as Irish things are from UK or France, they will be different in Nigeria or Honduras or Brazil. So we need to understand what is the situation, and not like, again, there's no one size fit all, you know. So we cannot assess, for example, and in my experience, we cannot assess an early career researcher from Rwanda and an early career researcher from the US using the same metrics and thinking that one is better than the other because of the resulting metrics. But they have different skills. Like even if a person from a low-income country or a country with weaker research institutions have had less access to, you know, do certain technique or like a specialized education, but there are certain strengths that may have been brought by going through a system like that. For example, creativity, problem solving. These are, for example, skills that when you live in a country that doesn't have all the resources, you have to kind of learn, you know. So it's different in each scenario. And I think that that's one thing that CoARA puts forward, which is we respect that there is no universal excellence, and that not all of us have to be measured in the same way. Yeah.
It's really interesting. And as I listen to all this, and maybe with the current hat that I have, I always wonder, you know, I really appreciate and value, I think it's so welcome, the advancement and discussions around research assessment. And then we have the big elephant around university level rankings in the corner. And I noted, Teresa, that you mentioned that obviously as a funder, you don't take into account, thankfully, and I know you don't, but it strikes me as the oddness in the system that's somewhere melting in all of this, that, you know, when we all discuss this, we come up against this, that in lots of ways people make this, here we are doing huge endeavours to, you know, acknowledge what you describe, which is the different experiences we bring, the different realities, the different journeys. And yet when people make decisions about what universities to go to, for example, maybe as international students, rankings are up front and centre, which are heavily dominant and informed by metrics. So just your views on that, and we don't have an answer to it, but just your views and reactions to that.
I mean, my initial reaction is that I don't know, in my innocence or naivety, because it just doesn't come into anything that we fund hasn't done in the 20 years that I've been there. But I mean, I was really, really struck by the big discussions in terms of the you know, the broader CoARA calls prior to the agreement. I wasn't aware that across Europe even there was so much. Both, you know, rankings of higher education institutions, and then also, you know, the processes and the ranking system within for promotions and so on. So I have to say, like, I mean, my eyes were opened. I was in a sort of like semi or fully deluded state in relation to some of that. So, but I think that's interesting, and I think it's one of the things in terms of the discussion at CoARA that, you know, and as we get into working groups and I mean, it'll be great to have a national chapter hosted, but actually actually the real benefit for me is that actually then when we share across different national chapters, like, you know, and we swap and share and we talk about these things and we give practical steps. So the first step in everything and changing is talking about it and putting it out there. And I think it was an elephant in the room for the first few calls. They were awkward, they were online, I suppose, but you know, I think they were awkward, and there did seem to be a tension there, for sure. So it will be interesting, but I mean, I think if this initiative was to do nothing else but to actually start having that conversation, it will be really beneficial. I mean, one of the other areas that came up again, which I hadn't really thought about a huge amount before joining the calls, going back to your question on EDI, so on. But I was struck by how much multilingualism came up on the call across the entire process, you know, from either recognising publications or the challenges in people in publishing or not, you know, just generally in terms of mobility in the assessment process, in the promotion process, you know, across the board. So that's an area that I think certainly we're in probably learning mode about, but I suppose it did get me thinking about, you know, from when we're selecting reviewers, you know, I mean, everybody speaks English, communicates with us in English, and you know, if they don't, you know, they're not getting back to us, you know. So I suppose again, it starts you. The thread started somewhere else, but it gets you thinking about actually back to the clinical trials participants. Well, actually, are we really contacting? We're not really contacting the world's best experts in area X. We're contacting the world's best experts that can actually communicate with us in our language. So I suppose that just planted a seed there as well. So I think it is, you know, pennies drop, even aside from, you know, if you have a particular agenda going into it, and that can only be good.
I agree with you, and I think if you agree, CoARA has achieved nothing else but actually have another platform for wider conversations, because I think by the mere range of participation you've described, Yensi, in CoARA, you know, the discussions we have around rankings and all these other pieces only get challenged where we have representation on a worldwide basis. I mean, and the rankings are very distinct in that there's certain jurisdictions that repeatedly score higher, are ranked higher, and they're just known, and there's all that element of it. And I think to really challenge that, I think an initiative. So for me, the EDI piece really is addressed by that, having CoARA, having the opportunity to have those conversations you described, which are going to be so important. I think long term, it won't change immediately. It's impossible to do it immediately. But the challenge in the system and the engagement of, you know, early people, career people, and a range of everyone in the ecosystem having that opportunity to talk is going to be so valuable. I won't say I have a slightly contrarian view, but I have a different view or a perspective in relation to, you know, perhaps the, you know, career stage and so on. I mean, just again, a reflection, and it's completely a personal reflection from watching things, particularly over, I suppose, the last maybe 10 years or so with things coming into the HRB. And for me, there's a kind of a mid-career cadre that have grown up on talking about open science and data and PPI and so on and so forth. And they're huge energy. They're just complete, this is just in their DNA. This is what they do. And I can't help but think, I mean, for those individuals, careful design of application forms and the narrative CV and so on has to make a difference to say, actually, the stuff that you're doing on the margins, the mentoring of students, the mentoring of the next, you know, early careers, particularly in our kind of cohort-based PhD programs and so on. They're a mid-career bunch, like, do you know what I mean, who should, if they were completely and utterly selfish about it, say, look, I need to get from A to B, and actually I'm going to just put my blinkers on, and I'm not going to get involved in all of this stuff, even though I'd love to. But they're not. They're getting stuck in at their institutions, in their groups, in their areas. They're going outside of their institutions, you know, some of our collaborative doctoral programs and so on. The supervisor cadre are often a whole pile of people who are kind of at emerging investigators, but they're not there yet. And God knows, like, you know, there's a challenge to get to the next step. But they're given their time, their energy, and their wherewithal to that.
endeavour and really, really driving the kind of ecosystem on. And for me, I always have them in my mind's eye when I think about sort of fair and responsible and research assessment. Because otherwise, why would you do it? I mean, they're driven, for sure, and back to the points that the NC made. But actually, you could say there are actually a whole pile of disincentives to doing that. We can't have that situation. For the people who put their head above the parapet in their discipline, in their kind of field, in their institution and so on, and try to start something new, build a new area, go where others haven't gone, that has to be rewarded. So that's just a perspective that I would have on it from watching it, which is not, it's not instead of, but there is that group that I think sometimes we don't talk about enough, and they're the ones leading us on that journey that we've talked about.
Yeah, very true, Teresa. And Ashling, from your perspective, what do you think might be the greatest barrier to, I suppose, the implementation of the vision or the ethos for what CoARA is attempting to achieve? Do you see hurdles on the landscape?
Well, you just mentioned one of them, which is the rankings, and I think it's actually taking this very narrow view of the rankings. And I think sometimes we take such a narrow view of this, and we're so interested in how can we show that we're doing excellently, because that's how we feel. It's not that, we want to show that we are doing excellent research, that we are providing an excellent education to our students, that we are a great place to come if you're a doctoral student. But if we take a step back and maybe see the wood from the trees a bit, if we're focused on quality and on excellence, instead of trying to tick boxes of I've published here, so therefore I must be excellent, if we take a step back and we focus more on that quality, on ensuring our research is excellence, well then the quality is going to rise and we're going to get there. But we need to have those conversations. We've also got to remember that this is going to be an iterative process. We're not going to, what I call a disruptor, it's not going to disrupt immediately. It's going to be incremental. We're going to move things. And we're not just moving ourselves, we're going to try and move those rankings as well and make them engage with us. Again, it's about putting ourselves back into saying, well, you're assessing us in ways that if we were to design a research study on how to assess universities, you wouldn't pick that. You wouldn't. So we're going to have to bring those with us.
Yeah, no, very valid points. I'm conscious of a question in the audience, I think. Is there?
Yeah,
Christine, go ahead.
Thanks. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. Some really important points have been raised there. I like the idea of bringing back the power, and I agree with you, Teresa, 100%. Early career researchers, PhD students, instinctively understand this. They come from a position where I need access to research, and open science is just part of what you would do. Why wouldn't you do it that way? What I'm interested to understand is, do you think this kind of an appreciation for the pace of how we assess things is going to need to change? Because we're very used to looking at quantitative data that gives us a number and throws out a result. But now we need more of a kind of informed evaluation of things, and our assessors need to be trained on much more than unconscious bias, in my view. So have you kind of a sense of that understanding is out there?
Again, just I think it's different in different contexts, and so when I have this conversation with other funders within my own organisation, with other funders, and probably Science Europe would have been the example of that, it's understood, and actually we've been doing it, elements of it, and doing pilots through DORA and so on for many years. So this feels like, even in context of CoARA working groups, we were kind of saying, well, how do we not reinvent the wheel in some instances? And we're not trying to duplicate some of the stuff that happens at the DORA discussion forum, and we participate in the reducing research waste in the UK, the EVER group, all around transparency and getting protocols published, and just avoiding duplication and so on, and we'd be in Go First. We're not trying to do that. So we're trying to get. The funders are trying to say, how can we really hone on the things that we haven't actually been doing? So I got a sense of urgency, of focus. This isn't a tick box. This isn't, I did get a real sense that the numbers were clearly much bigger, and like I said, it kind of opened my eyes a bit in terms of the diversity and the breadth of the thing. But I think higher education institutions is going to be a bigger challenge there in terms of probably initially, either in working groups or otherwise, feeling it is a safe space, building. Many of us as funders, because we've been doing this for years, we've been in the Science Europe group, at least, we kind of know one another, like, do you know what I mean? We're sort of sick of seeing one another. So there is an element of that. So I do get different senses in the different groups I'm in, where it's kind of slowly, cautiously, how are we going to put the elephant on that's in the room on the table and start moving forward with it in that safe space. Whereas I do think from both national funders and generally in Europe, there's a real, this now has to be how we do it. The challenge in I can say certainly even within our own organisation is it's still expected that you run about like, you know, sort of like 20 calls a year and you're doing this stuff, and I'm looking at the same people to do each of it, you know, and so people are now supposed to be in 3 places at the same time, and you know, so there it goes back to the kind of, you know, thinking about how we design our organisations and our teams and our units to make sure that we don't have a group off to the side that's their job, because that's not good, and we've seen where that's left us with many other things in education and research. It has to be something that is in everybody's job, but if it's in everybody's job, it may not get done. So for me, it sounds a very dull and boring challenge, but actually it is that. I do think there is an element of action planning. Like I said, I mean, we have it stitched into our strategic goals. We didn't come at it as a kind of an action plan, and I see some organisations are using CoARA to say, here's an action plan for what we're going to do. We may well do that, because it might be a good way of tracking from over the 5 years. So I think that's probably something that organisations could do, is actually decide of all of the things that we could do, and there is a long list in CoARA, what would the maybe 3 that we're going to tackle, and in what order to do that, and I think that certainly the third thing for us has been, it's been very clear to me in any event, whether it be because of the accountability agenda and demonstrating impact, or the healthier conversation around what is impact and what is quality and so on, that CoARA brings is we're sort of trying to reboot what has become over many years since the moratorium a defunct evaluation function in the HRB. So we've recruited in a new evaluation lead. We've done a review of evaluation practices worldwide in similar organisations, and we're about to go to our board with an implementation plan. And so the key question in that is, what are we looking to measure, what's important, and how do we measure how things are done, like open practice and PPI and so on, as well as what we're doing. And we probably will take more of a case study approach to trying to demonstrate things. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's been kind of an obvious gap and win for us. We can't really have this conversation. We'll have a conversation that feels more theoretical than practical, and we want to promote cases of, you know, people with diverse perspectives, diverse backgrounds, people who've taken a career break and come back into research and weren't penalised because of that, or somebody who's done mobility, or you know, even switched schools or gone into another area. And that, so I think the more we do that and we profile it and put it out there and show that it was relevant, they've made a difference in what they set out to do, I think that's important.
Yensi, you want to jump in?
So just in support, so it's an excellent question, and it is a difficult one. So the important issue, I think, is that we're asking ourselves that, and it's important that we're doing it in this context, because we are all CoARA, and we are learning and asking the hard questions to make it better, you know, from all of our perspectives, from different perspectives. So this is what it is. It is a difficult topic to address, yeah.
Okay, folks, I'm conscious of times. Any final questions from the audience? Yep, great.
Just a comment. Really enjoyed this conversation. I think it's really important that the assessments are broader than they are. I think what will happen, it will take a long time, but expectations need to change at the other side. Like, what expectations are there of researchers? And funders, when they change their expectations of researchers, that will incrementally grow. So when early career researchers then know what the expectations are, PhD students will come along. So it will take a number of years, but I absolutely agree. I think we need to be more diverse in our expectations. I love the idea of all this equality and diversity in roles as well in research, because there is the understanding of the researcher, the PI, the co-PI, the research administrator maybe, but there are other roles involved, technical roles, librarian roles, and those kind of areas. I think it's lovely to see them included. So I love the fact that there are early career researchers at this global level having these conversations, and I would absolutely be delighted to know that there would be working groups that would include all levels, you know, in future, researchers and funders having conversations together. So thank you for, it's just a comment, and thank you. It was a wonderful afternoon.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks, Alice. Appreciate it. I think there's another question at the back there.
Thanks. Very interesting discussion. I suppose there's two issues as well. I'd just like to know your views on it. We've seen, obviously, the proliferation of research across all disciplines. There's so much of it out there. Predatory journals, all of that. People, and you've talked about people trying to publish. We know that researchers now can't publish for ages because people can't find reviewers, and they're getting a kind of a request a day to review for a load of different journals. So one question is, I suppose, the IREL consortium deal is ending, so the open access is going away, unless that's brinkmanship to bring Elsevier and Co back to the table, I don't know. So the two questions, I suppose, are, first, do you think all publicly funded research should be mandated to be open access with no paywall, no fee paid to any journal? But second, do you think reviewers, in order to, I suppose, streamlining, should be remunerated for their work rather than general recognition? Do we have to pay researchers, and will this get rid of a lot of the journals, not just the predatory, but middle-ranking ones that nobody reads the papers in? I'd just be interested in all your thoughts on that.
While they're waiting to reflect, I'll just, and they're getting their thoughts together. Years ago, I remember a group of students that I was teaching, where we were talking about research papers, and they said to me, like, Norelee, how much did you get paid per paper? And I was like, I don't get paid anything. And then they looked at me and went, why on earth do you do it? So it was just fascinating. It just struck me there, Paul, when you talk about that. There's a whole landscape here, but the reviewing piece is really interesting, and I think Ashling and Yensi look like they've got a big response waiting. So I might start with you, Ashling.
Yeah, I'll start off, and I'm going to say, first of all, the IRL deal with Elsevier, we're up until 2025. We currently actually have, I think, about 22 deals with different publishers, and I'm going to say that it is unnecessarily complicated for an individual researcher to figure out where and how they can publish without landing a $3,000 bill. And I am one of the people who has to administer this. And it cannot be sustained for a length of time. These deals can only be considered transitionary. We cannot be paying the amount of money we are paying if we're going to stick with this landscape. It's one thing to go through a little bit of pain, knowing that we will come out the other end with a fair and equitable publishing landscape. And as I mentioned before, I want to see researchers more in control of their research and deciding where they want to publish. If that means that they publish in a journal that's been there for 150 years, absolutely, that's where you want to publish. It's the best venue. If it means publishing in HRB Open or another open publishing, then that's what I want to see. It's incremental. We're going to move very, very, very slowly. Yes, I do believe that all publicly funded research should be publicly available to everybody. It's a basic. I think any researchers here, you want your work to be seen by the most people possible. The funders, they want that to happen. What's stopping us? Well, there's some people there in the middle, and we need to get them into rooms too, and we need to probably get tough with them. We may have to go through some pain with them in the future. As regards peer review, researchers, you do need to at the very least, get credit for it. I've always, the whole publishing system as regards pay, as I already mentioned, is unusual. I think we wouldn't find it anywhere else. Regarding peer review, yeah, I do think you should definitely get some acknowledgement for it. How we go about pay, and then when it comes to peer review, if you're paid for it, I suppose it brings in a little bit of a research integrity question as well. So how we go around doing that. So the likes of the HRB Open you do open peer review, I think, Teresa, and so do a lot of us. That can work very well in some cases, but people can be very wary of it too. You know, and I do think that we're going to have to. I'm not giving you any really good answer here. I'm aware of it. I'm kind of giving you my thought process of what the landscape is like. And again, it's a process we're going to have to go through over the next few years as we move the publishing environment to one that works for us rather than that's working against us.
So this is the voice of my group in GYA. My views are not mine in this. Well, they're mine too, but not only mine. So my colleagues in the GYA are very passionate about this topic, and they believe that this system is a system that fits the 17th century with a technology that was invented in the 15th century and that is no longer fit for purpose. And that research assessment has a central role in changing this, because if we stop valuing or incentivizing publishing in certain journals and instead incentivize the publication on open access or like platforms that are available for everyone, it doesn't even have to be a scientific journal if it's peer review. For example, the GYA publishes reports and they're peer reviewed. And they're accessible and indexed, and they have the permanent persistent identifiers. So this is possible. Another point of that is also for reviewers. This also has to do with research assessment, because if institutions that are hiring or grant or the funders acknowledge or like ask, are you a peer review? Then you are acknowledged and you spend part of your working day, you know, an hour, let's say a week you spend, and it's part of your contract on doing peer review because it's essential for the sustainability of research community. It's an essential role in everything. Yeah.
Just to echo what has been said, I mean, I think it is a problem, and you've named it, and I think we have to figure it out how we go forward on it. I mean, I'm optimistic. Again, back to we've been having these conversations for years, and I think there are good people sitting around the table with plans. I think there are some barriers to get through till we come out the other end of it. But I mean, I'm optimistic that at least that kind of fight has been fought, as it were, and it's understood from certainly from our perspective as a funder in terms of anybody that does peer review for us, notwithstanding what I've said about the kind of multilingualism issue. We've never paid peer reviewers, and I don't think we're minded to do it for the concerns that Ashling referenced. However, where we have and are currently trying to sort of switch on functionality within our sort of GEM system is similar to the ORCID IDs for the researchers. We want to acknowledge anybody who ever provides any peer review service for the HRB, and that will be part of their identifier, and that they can then, through whatever they're applying for and whenever they're trying to talk about their contributions to the wider research and innovation ecosystem, at least be able to point to us and to be able to track that. And I think, again, that's something that I think is really important, and certainly in the funders group is something that we're all aspiring to work towards, because it needs to be recognised and it needs to be acknowledged, and you could just keep going on and on, even in relation to things like, research ethics committees and all that. So, I mean, don't start me on that in terms of the time, but and certainly at our grant holder conference that we had this year for the HRB, we spent a lot of time we had a fascinating guest speaker come across from UKRI, actually she's head of equality, diversity and inclusion over there, but she was talking to us about the terminology that she has coined as pipe work, which she describes everybody that we never see necessarily in the research world who is keeping the show on the road. Anyway, so just a plug for her if it's something that interests you, because I think it's really, really important, and it's why I mention it all the time in this context. And I suppose it was probably one of the 20 ERA priorities, European Research Area priorities, many of which overlap in this. It's the one. Well, it was of the two that I was disappointed that Ireland didn't sign up for. One was the research infrastructures, and the other was under the heading of the R&I ecosystem. But that was all about getting into whether it be in research offices or libraries or support teams or whatever. Who are all the or technical people or data stewards? It just goes on and on. Who are all the people that increasingly are necessary to keep the show on the road? And actually will free up time and help all of us, but actually nobody's really talking about. So any time, and apologies for saying that at the end, but any audience I get in any group, particularly in an Irish context, I just keep sort of saying that's the one, that if we actually have a serious conversation about that, we'll actually help resolve many of the other issues that are flagged as priorities.
Yeah, you're right, Teresa. I mean, and it is, I think I won't say there's full awareness, but I think there's increasing understanding of exactly what you're describing. It's the magic sauce, the glue in the system, the pipe work, whatever term, but it's increasingly essential, and the expertise in what they bring. And as a researcher, having that expertise available to colleagues in the library, the Office of Vice President of Research, colleagues in the institutes that we have, the expertise, the knowledge. I mean, you can't be all things as a researcher or as a grant writer. You have to draw on that expertise, but supporting that in the system sustainably is the key question that we have. And I think, maybe, a conversation for another day perhaps, but because we do have to finish, but it's really valuable. Tofal, I'm really conscious of time, but you can pop in. Yep.
I can ask the question personally.
We'll be fine if you're,
Because I heard the word infrastructure, so my question is to Teresa, that what type of physical infrastructure Health Research Board has funded so far? Like clinical imaging, sterilization. These are the critical infrastructure that our health researchers usually don't have access to, as far as I know. So
absolutely. I mean, I think we have a long-standing need for investing in infrastructure, research-related infrastructures, not just in health research, but across the board. I mean, we haven't had, since the last PRTLI programme, from our perspective, I mean, the approach that we would have taken, maybe 10, 15 years ago when PRTLI was there as an option to build out technology platforms or infrastructure or so on in the higher education institutes. We kind of played our role in terms of thinking about what do we need to put into the hospitals at that time. I know it's broader than hospitals, but starting with kind of those places where the healthcare professionals were, so the clinical research facilities and building out those units to recruit into trials and studies. So building on what was in the academic setting, but different, and doing those kind of interfacing roles. But in truth, I think it's fair to say that no funder really has invested outside of maybe what is in a centre grant and is available within that, really in a kind of a structured, proactive, smart approach. We haven't invested in infrastructure and the fast-moving and evolving technology platforms or systems that will support managed fair and open data and things like that. So I think there's very specific issues and there are cross-cutting issues, and it doesn't please me to say that not a lot is the answer to your question, if I'm being absolutely honest about it, and really mostly because you're kind of restricted in what you can do through kind of grant, ad hoc grant funding. So you need to come at it almost like, I suppose, Ireland, invests in its roads and railways and so on through the National Development Plan. So to my mind, and I suppose, again, any chance I get in a kind of a national conversation, I'm saying, well, what about a capital package in the next National Development Plan where we actually realise that we have 20 years catching up to do on this stuff, and we will be an outlier. We've talked about collaboration, but we have to bring something to the game. We can't always be taking from others. So I think a huge area for me, a really, really huge area, and big developments in Europe in relation to infrastructures. It's increasingly going that way. We're involved in a genomics initiative, and they're building out a federated data infrastructure, and we've jumped in with not a lot of money, but we've jumped in because we kind of think we can't afford not to be in, and now we're desperately trying to get others in there. But it's almost, you get to the stage where if you don't actually have the infrastructure built up on the standards and the interoperability things that the kind of coordinated plan in Europe is, you will be locked out. And we started to see that. I mean, I certainly saw it firsthand during COVID when I was working in the Department of Health. I mean, even in terms of trying to share COVID data and so on and so forth. If you didn't actually have the kind of, the data infrastructure and the hubs, and we didn't have a node for sharing population health information, we were like, what? But other countries did, and we realised they did. And if you don't have it, and if you can't do it in a particular way, well, then actually we're going to find ourselves with great people and great ideas and huge enthusiasm, but so we actually need to join the national infrastructure conversation with the European at a minimum, and clearly it's global, but with that for me is a must, and we need to track that really, really closely. So that's an issue that I suppose we keep raising in kind of either the European, the Horizon Europe high level group, or Impact 2030. But again, hence my disappointment that the two of the topics that we didn't touch were research infrastructure. So hopefully, like the question on working groups, will there be another float? I'm hoping that there are two areas, because actually they probably would have been the two that I would have started with.
I think that's a really good note to finish on, because I think we could have an ongoing conversation about the ongoing need for investment, and I absolutely understand fully and support, and where we can in the IUA and through my colleagues, we make similar representation to the infrastructure, the equipment. There's no point in having a load more PhDs, postdocs, for example, if the equipment they're all working on is either out of date or non-existent or not anyway compatible with what's happening with our colleagues across the world. So thank you all. Listen, I think we've had a wonderful afternoon. I mean, the pleasure and a privilege to have such a wonderful panel with Ashling Hayes, with Yensi Flores Bueso, and also with Teresa Maguire. I want to thank you all very much. I think the future is bright. I think when we can have conversations like this and recognise and work together, things will, over our lifetimes, will certainly change. But thank you all very much. Delighted to have you here today. Thank you.